Jeroen, you've studied scientism. Can you tell us what it means and also give us one example of scientism?
Sure. So scientism basically has to do with reliance on science when it comes to knowledge and rational belief. So it means sort of putting your faith in the deliverances of science when it comes to forming beliefs about ourselves and the world. And so one example of this is if people sort of wonder about questions like, do people have free will? Is there a God? Are we sort of rational? Or is our behavior all determined by unconscious influences? People who sort of are adherents of scientism, they sort of turn to science to find answers to these questions. So they will look at science, and apparently or at least some science suggests that we don't have free will, that our behavior is not the result of rational deliberation, but it's determined by unconscious influences, by factors in the environment. And you get sort of popular books saying that free will is an illusion, that our behavior is completely sort of determined by these unconscious factors. Or, of course, popular books saying that science has now shown that there is no God. Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, for example, it seems like a paradigmatic case of scientism.
What's the problem with these sorts of claims then?
There are lots of problems with them, I think. But let me just mention one to start with. So the thing is, it seems to me that as human beings, we have lots of different ways of forming beliefs, right? So we have sort of our ordinary modes of forming beliefs, like sense perception, so we memorize things, or we remember things. We learn from others. And we are able to sort of empathize with others, to find out how they feel by interacting with them. And of course, we have reasoning and sort of inferential ways of forming beliefs, drawing conclusions from evidence. And all of that are sort of all ways that we use to form beliefs. Science uses some of them very systematically. Of course, science is about careful perception. It's about drawing conclusions from your data. But science doesn't use all of these faculties, or at least not to the same extent and in the same rigorous way. So the problem is, when you're an adherent of scientism, I think you're basically sort of prioritizing certain ways of forming beliefs over others. Whereas I guess my advice would be, well, use all of these different faculties that we have, and don't prioritize some at the expense of others. Because the point is, these faculties are good for different things, right? Science might be an excellent way, it probably is. I mean, in fact, it is an excellent way of finding out about the natural world. But it might not be the best way to form beliefs about how others feel, or about issues in philosophy or in morality. In fact, I think it's hard to see how science is going to give us information about what right and wrong is, about how to act in life. I mean, there's no sort of scientific inquiry that seems to provide answers to these sorts of questions.
Or whether God exists.
Perhaps. Right. I think the question of God's existence, well, it sort of depends a little bit on how people think about God. Because, it depends on your concept of God, I suppose. And if you think that God is sort of active in the world all the time, performing lots of miracles, maybe, then if that's your view of God, then of course some of that is going to be within the purview of science, because the natural world and what happens within it is within the purview of science. So if sort of people think that way about God, then to some extent the existence of God might depend a little bit on what science tells you. But if you think God is more of a hands-off manager, maybe not completely hands-off, but he isn't sort of constantly changing the way the world works, but he is sort of watching it from a distance, as it were, intervening maybe sometime, but not a lot of the times, then it's, again, for me at least, it's hard to see how science is going to disprove that God exists or prove that he exists. Maybe some sort of scientific developments are relevant to questions about God's existence, but it seems that it's largely a philosophical question.